Today we're going to cover a case that'll make you wonder if you can ever truly know somebody. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. Jessie Blodgett was a 19-year-old woman living in Hartford, Wisconsin with her parents. The town of Hartford is actually located northwest of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Hartford, Wisconsin is pretty much a small town. It has some nice restaurants and a nice community theater. Buck and Joy Blodgett were overjoyed when they learned that they were going to finally have a child. Jessie had actually been a miracle child in their eyes. Up until that point, they hadn't been able to conceive. Jessie was actually born completely natural and at home. There was no doctors and no drugs, just Joy and Buck and their midwife, and now their new baby, Jessie. And from the moment she entered into their lives, they were head over heels for her. Buck and Joy would soon realize that their daughter was incredibly intelligent and wildly talented. She was a passionate and incredible piano player. She sang in the high school choir and participated in musicals. She would write and sing her own music. Jessie was passionate about protecting animal rights and was a fierce advocate for ending domestic violence against women. After high school, Jessie would attend UW-Milwaukee to continue her passion for music. During the summer, Jessie came home from college and she actually decided to open her own business. She was going to teach piano and violin and singing lessons, and within 2 months, she had 26 students. And I think that speaks volumes for the type of person Jessie was and her talent. Her best friend Jacqueline would say that every time I would go over to her house, she would be playing the piano. Even when I was trying to talk to her, she would be playing the piano and I'd be like, I'm trying to talk to you. She was always singing, always dancing. On July 14, 2013, Jessie had finished her last show of Fiddler on the Roof. After the show, Jessie decided to attend a cast party at her friend's house. Jessie wouldn't arrive back home until about 1 a.m. the next day. When Jessie arrived home, Joy instantly realized that something didn't seem right. Joy would ask her daughter Jessie what was wrong, and Jessie would tell her that 2 men at the cast party had made her feel a bit uncomfortable, but she didn't really get into more details. Eventually, Joy would head to bed, and Jessie would go to her room and write in her journal about the incident that night. Jessie would write, I think I'm being corrupted. I think certain men are taking what should be platonic love and perverting it into a competition. I am not helpless. I will recognize problems and confront them without fear. God be with me. On the next morning, July 15, 2013, Joy would take some laundry into her daughter's room at around 8 a.m. that morning, before she headed to work. As she entered her daughter's room, she debated waking Jessie up just to tell her she was leaving and to make sure that she got up on time because her student was coming for a lesson. But she ultimately decided, because it was Jessie's break and she didn't really get to sleep in often and she had come home late, to just let her sleep in and enjoy being home. So Joy left the laundry, snuck out of her daughter's room, and headed to work. About 4 hours later, Joy would actually arrive home at around noon for lunch. When she entered the house, she noticed that Jessie wasn't up yet, but her car was still in the driveway. She did feel like this was strange because Jessie was really responsible and she had a student coming at 12:30, so she needed to be up and planning her lesson. So Joy yelled up to her daughter and said, your student's gonna be here soon, make sure you're up, and then she went and prepared her lunch. At 12:30, the student arrived, and to Joy's surprise, Jessie wasn't up yet. So she let the student in and she said, give me a minute, I'm gonna go get Jessie. So she went into Jessie's room and went over to her bed, and soon she realized that her daughter was not breathing and she was cold. She would immediately call 911, and during the call, she's frantic. She's saying she's cold, Jessie, she's so cold, and she's just in an utter state of anguish right now. She doesn't know what happened. She just needs somebody to get there immediately. Eventually, Joy would actually roll her daughter over in bed, and what she sees next leaves her completely startled. She would tell the 911 dispatcher that Jessie was all wet. Her clothes were wet, her hair was wet, and that it looked like she had strangulation marks on her neck. Joy would start CPR as she waited for the EMS crew to arrive, but unfortunately, it was too late. Jesse had been dead. When investigators arrived on scene, they soon realized that Joy had been right. There were marks around the girl's neck and wrist, and they soon realized they probably had a murder on their hands. So they removed Joy from the room and they began their investigation. Detective Thickens was at the scene, and he would later go on to say that we found Jessie on the floor, very obvious mark on her neck and marks on her wrists, very faint marks that could possibly have been binding marks. At that point, I believed we had a homicide on our hands. Jessie's mom would give the detectives a clue that would eventually help solve the case. She told detectives that Jessie had been placed in bed wet. Her hair was wet and her clothing was wet, and detectives really thought this was strange. They would soon realize that the killer had staged the body, that at some point he had removed her body from the bedroom, taken the body to the bathroom, and washed Jessie. The killer would then take Jessie back to her bed, place her in it, and tuck her in. They also realized that there were no signs of forced entry into the house, so either the killer knew the family or had been watching them. After reading Jessie's diary, they soon honed in on those two men that had made her feel very uncomfortable at the cast party. One of them had even pulled her into his lap, but the police were able to quickly rule out these men, and then they were left stumped. They had no idea who would want to hurt Jessie. On July 12th, 2013, in the neighboring town of Richfield, a 21-year-old named Melissa Etzler is walking her dog. As Melissa is walking with her dog, she suddenly hears footsteps behind her. She turns quickly and sees a man. She kind of laughs it off and says, "Oh, you scared me," and then continues on her walk. But then she hears those footsteps again, and this time when she turns around, she sees this man, and he has a knife. He would attack her and force her to the ground, and as they're struggling, she is grabbing at the blade, which is obviously injuring her hands very badly, and she's fighting him, and she eventually manages to get this knife away from him, but they're still in this struggle. Eventually, he can't get this knife back from Melissa, and he looks at her and he says, "Can I just go?" And at this point, he's still on top of Melissa, which is just completely bizarre. Eventually, he ran off and Melissa was taken to the hospital. A few days later, after she was released from the hospital, Melissa would actually go to the park and reenact the whole thing for police officers. She would describe her attacker as male. He was probably 18 to 20 years old. He was 6'2" and probably 200 or so pounds. He had light blonde hair, fair skin, and was wearing plaid shorts that day. Luckily, she remembered what he had been driving that day, a navy blue Dodge Caravan. With all of this information, police release a compository sketch of the suspect, but to their surprise, they get no leads. That is until they release the details of the car the suspect had fled in. They suddenly were getting tips, and one of those tips came from inside the police department. A deputy had actually approached the detective on the case and said, "Listen, when I was over there, I noticed this van and I thought it was sketchy, so I ran the license plate just in case." And this deputy actually went back a few weeks and looked at every single license plate he ran until he could find that one license plate and handed it to the detective. They would quickly realize that the owner of the van didn't match the suspect, but they found out the owner of the van had a son and he matched that description. Back in Hartford, a few days after Jessie's murder, the family is holding a vigil at their house. Everybody's in the living room in a big circle and they're sharing memories and just being all together in honor of Jessie. Among the sea of people there, of Jessie's friends and family, her ex-boyfriend Daniel had actually been there as well. Daniel Bartelt had actually dated Jessie their freshman year of high school for a few months, but they hadn't worked out and they realized they were better off as friends. They had actually been really close friends in high school. They sat together every day, they wrote music together and shared in their passion and love for music and acting. Eventually, the two of them would go to different colleges and drifted apart until that summer. Daniel, who had been a straight-A student, had actually dropped out of college to the surprise of everyone that knew him. Even Joy and Buck were surprised when Jessie told them that Daniel had dropped out of school. Around this time, Jessie and Daniel would actually pick up their friendship again and start writing and collaborating. During the memorial that day, Daniel, as he's sitting in the circle and he's talking with everybody and he's talking a lot about Jessie, he received a phone call. He answered his phone and it was a detective on the other line. After talking on the phone for a quick minute, he hangs up and he looks at everyone and said that he got called down to the police station. Jessie's friend Jacqueline would note that he didn't seem surprised or even really stressed about this. And Joy and Buck would comfort him and say say, listen, they're gonna go and talk to every one of Jesse's friends. That's what they do in an investigation. It's nothing to be stressed about. You're gonna be okay. They would hug him and comfort him, and then he would head off to the police station. But on the other end of that line, Detective Walsh, who had placed the call to Daniel, realized something pretty strange. When he called Daniel and asked Daniel to come to the police station, Daniel didn't ask why. He didn't even ask what this was about or what it was regarding. And typically, people who get called by a detective or a police officer are going to question why they need to come to the police station for an interview. But Daniel hadn't done this. Daniel would head to the police station, and when he arrived, as he sat in the interview room, the detective would start by making small talk. He actually asked Daniel what he had been doing prior to coming to the police station, and Daniel said that he was at Jesse's memorial. The detective would then ask Daniel, oh, what happened to her? And he responded by saying, I think someone murdered and raped her. Eventually, the detectives would move on to the Melissa Etzler case and began to question Daniel about it. And as he's questioning Daniel, and Daniel denying knowing anything about this, he notices an injury on Daniel's elbow. And when he asked him where he got it from, he said that he probably fell. This instantly grabs the detective's attention. The detective would ask Daniel to show him his hands, and he would notice an injury on his thumb. Daniel would claim that he got stabbed with a screw at work. The detective kept questioning him, and he said, so if I call over to your place of employment, they're going to say that you work there. Daniel would simply say, no. And the detective would say, okay, that's what I thought. It would turn out that Daniel had actually lost his job, but he was still getting up every single day, getting dressed, and heading to work. No one knew that he had lost his job. Eventually, with more questions and pressure, Daniel would admit to attacking Melissa. And his reason why was because he wanted somebody else to feel scared. He basically told detectives that when he dropped out of college, he felt frightened of life and wanted to make somebody else feel the same way. Even without Daniel's confession, they had tons of evidence at the crime scene. They had Daniel's blood on multiple items. They had a roll of duct tape, which matched the tape found in Daniel's family home. And during a lineup, Melissa was able to identify him easily. Daniel was arrested for this attack, but something was still bothering the detectives. During the beginning of that interview, the detective asked about Jesse's case, and Daniel had stated that she was murdered and raped. The thing is, detectives hadn't known at the time that Jesse had been sexually assaulted, which means that information is something only the killer would have known. While Daniel sat in prison, warrants were issued for his house, and what they found would shock them. On his computer, they would find incredibly dark and disturbing pornography that was very violent. They would also find searches for serial killers, but what really shocked them was that they found a snuff film, and it seemed to match the crime scene at Jesse's house to a T. In the movie that they found, after the man strangles a woman, he washes her. And as you'll remember, in that initial 911 dispatch call, Joy mentions her daughter was wet, her hair and her clothing. She was placed back in bed with the covers over her. Police began to think that this wasn't a coincidence. But it turns out Daniel had an alibi. That day, he was at Woodland Park trying to write. And when they pulled surveillance videos, they did find Daniel there. And Jesse's own parents were telling police that there was no way Daniel could have done this, that they were very close, that they were great friends, and Daniel was not that type of person. And although detectives weren't sure if they had Jesse's killer, they decided to search the park, and when they removed the trash bins, they found quite a bit of evidence. Inside a cereal box that was placed in the garbage can was a ball gag, ligatures, and alcohol wipes. And the rope that they also found in the trash can matched the marks on Jesse's neck. And when detectives searched Daniel's house, they found that exact rope in his garage. And then a week after Jesse's murder, investigators went to the crime scene and looked again to make sure they hadn't been missing anything. And it turns out they did. Under her bed was a roll of tape, and that tape matched the tape found at Daniel's house and the tape used on the attack of Melissa. And that tape had Daniel's fingerprints all over it. Based on the evidence, detectives theorized that Daniel entered Jesse's bedroom, but they didn't know if she was awake or asleep at that point. Either way, she probably wouldn't have been too startled to see Daniel there because they were pretty close. Daniel would hogtie her, he would place the ball gag in her mouth and then place tape over it so that she couldn't get it out. He would eventually sexually assault her and strangle her. They found Daniel and Jesse's DNA on that rope, and under her fingernails was Daniel's DNA. And they recovered DNA from the sexual assault that they hadn't originally known about. As for motive, one can only theorize, because Daniel himself maintains his innocence. But based on the internet searches and the attack on Melissa and then the attack on Jesse, one could assume that Daniel was unleashing his urges, and detectives would theorize that he really is a sociopath. He lacked empathy, empathy, he was cold, he was calculated, and he waited for an opportunity to attack somebody he was supposed to love. And he did it simply because he wanted to. And because the attack on Melissa hadn't worked out, he needed a new victim. And he knew Jesse, and he knew the family, and he knew that this time it would work. Daniel was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Although he never confessed the crime, he's never shown any amount of remorse or empathy for what he did to Jesse. And although Buck and Joy had lost their daughter, Buck had read quite an amazing victim impact statement. Towards the end of his statement, he said, "I believe there is good and bad in every one of us, so I do not demonize or vilify you. That's too easy. That makes it too easy for the rest of us to separate ourselves and our humanity from you and yours. To the evil in you that you chose to follow, I say this. This was a monumental loss for evil and a stunning win for love. You stole Jesse's life and future. You had power and dominion over her body for a few minutes, but never for 1 second did you have 1 ounce of power or control over her spirit, her heart, her will, her grace, her beautiful goodness, and her deep love." And I think that speaks so much to Jesse and to Joy and Buck and the type of people they are. In honor of their daughter, they actually started a nonprofit called Love is Greater Than Hate. Their mission is to end violence against women and, of course, to choose love over hate. And they thought that Jesse would really appreciate this. I'm going to place the link for their nonprofit in the comments, so if you want to check it out and maybe donate or get involved with it, that would be incredible. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. And while you wait for the next video, be sure to check out some other videos and let me know in the comments if you have a specific case you'd like me to cover. See you next time.